Welcome to the Risk Intelligence Podcast, where the Global Association of Risk Professionals, also known as GARP, brings together the world's foremost risk practitioners from around the globe for in-depth insights and discussions on today's most important risk issues in finance and energy. Fully in effect, as of May 25, 2018, the far-reaching data security and privacy provisions of the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, are no longer hypothetical for risk managers and compliance officers. In this podcast, Information Security Forum Managing Director Steve Durbin discusses the corporate world's state of preparedness as it approaches the ongoing financial, operational, and reputational challenges. Let's listen in.
Greetings to all. I'm Jeff Cutler, Editor-in-Chief of Risk Intelligence at GARP, the Global Association of Risk Professionals. Welcome to the latest in our podcast series, and welcome back to our guest, Steve Durbin. Steve is Managing Director of the Information Security Forum, which has been active for many years internationally as an educational and information sharing organization in the cybersecurity space. We spoke to Steve previously about the ISF's outlook on the cyber threat and information risk landscape, as in the Threat Horizon 2020 report that the ISF came out with in March. Today, our headline topic is the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, a far-reaching policy of the European Union and the compliance and related risks that have built up around it. There were literally lots of headlines about GDPR leading up to the effective date of May the 25th. Our discussion now is about the ongoing reality of it, and it is a subject that Steve Durbin remains immersed in. So, Steve, welcome again.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to be back.
Let's talk about what was May 25th all about. What happened on that day? The world didn't stop turning, did it?
No, it didn't, and I think that was probably a surprise to many people who'd really built up the 25th of May as being this key date. And in fairness, it was. So it was the date, really, that the journey began, or the game kicked off, whichever sporting analogy you really want to use there. I think that a lot of organizations all around the world who'd been holding European data had really been preparing themselves for that day. It came and it went, and now we're waiting to see what the effect of that regulation being in place will be.
There was some alarm embodied in those headlines I referred to about preparations or status of preparations, or some large percentage of organizations not being ready on the effective date. Was that a major issue or concern?
I think it's always a concern, but Jeff, in reality, very few organizations are ever going to be 100% ready for the day or the date at which a new regulation comes in. I think that what many organizations had underestimated was the sheer size of the task. I mean, the GDPR is a very far-reaching piece of legislation that impacts the way in which the majority of organizations who handle European data really go about transacting business. And I've said for quite some while now that for me the GDPR isn't just a piece of compliance. It is a business transformation program, because you do have to take a very long and hard look at the way in which you collect, use, store personal information as it relates to European citizens, or indeed if you happen to be an organization that is based in Europe, so a US-based organization perhaps that has a subsidiary in a European country, then you really need to be looking at how you can comply with that regulation across every aspect of your business. And I think that's where people really began to underestimate the size of the task.
Yeah, so just to step back a bit, there may be some people who are not completely up to speed on what GDPR is and who it affects. How far-reaching really is it? I mean, this is not just something that is confined to organizations in the European Union.
No, it isn't. And I think that was a misconception in the beginning for some companies. Basically, if an organization holds or handles the data of a European citizen anywhere in the world, then the GDPR applies. If an organization has its subsidiary headquarters or perhaps remote offices that are based in the European Union that are using data in any way, shape, or form, then the GDPR applies. So if we think about that within a global context, it affects pretty much every multinational organization that operates on a global scale, irrespective of where they happen to be working. It may affect, for instance, if we look at the United States, an organization that perhaps is employing a European citizen, say in New York or Chicago or Washington, wherever it happens to be. So the full sort of implication of GDPR isn't just about the way in which we perhaps transact business. It is about the basic fundamental of what information are we storing as it relates to a European citizen. And that applies across the organization and indeed across any of the third-party organizations with which that organization is engaged if information of a personal nature is being shared. So again, if we look at it from a supply chain standpoint, the risk associated with personal information being shared across very extensive supply chains is a very real one. And I think that's what a lot of organizations, as I say, had perhaps underestimated in terms of the amount of work that's required to get themselves in shape for the 25th of May.
Now, as a rule, risks and challenges like this present opportunities, do they not? There are benefits down the road to complying.
Oh, absolutely. And this is why I've been talking about it as a business transformation program. I mean, just speaking from very personal experience, if I look at the way in which our marketing programs at the ISF have had to change, the downside is that people have had to opt in to receive information from us. On the other hand, what it has done is reduce very significantly the amount of people that perhaps don't have any real interest in the services that the ISF might be able to provide. And so whilst we're seeing a reduction in the number of people that are interested, we're seeing an increase in the quality of that level of interest. So, and this is just very, very early stages. So I think that organizations certainly are going to be very much more aware of some of the benefits associated with GDPR. I think many of them have taken it as an opportunity to reduce the amount of information and data that they've been holding. If you really don't require it, then the advice was always to get rid of it. And I think for a number of organizations as well, it's presented something of an opportunity on the security and the risk side to gain a better understanding of the way in which the business actually operates and actually uses data. That, of course, has come with its challenges as well.
Based on what you hear and know about the organizations you talk to, what is the current priority when it comes to GDPR? Are we in a second phase or a defined phase of stepping up and ramping up for it? Is there still catching up to be done?
Yeah, I think so, Jeff. I mean, I think that the vast majority of organizations that I speak to, irrespective of where they happen to be based, whether it be within the European Union or elsewhere in the world, are not in a state of 100% compliance. And I think it would have been unrealistic to have expected that. I think that a lot of organizations, though, do have a good understanding of what the requirements of the regulation are. I think they have done quite an amount of data cleaning, if you like. I think that they have implemented things like the subject access request policy and process. I think they do have a data protection impact assessment program in place. Some of them will have appointed data protection officers. This is a requirement if you happen to be a large organization or if your organization is dependent upon personal data for the conduct of business. And so I think they've ticked the box in terms of, what are the basic elements that needed to be put in place. The second phase is now how do we make sure that is effectively institutionalized, ingrained across the business. One of the key elements of that is in training and education. So one of the risks certainly associated with the GDPR, of course, is that because everybody is collecting personal data all of the time, how do you ensure that you do have some of the protections in place across every aspect of your business? So if we take an example, for instance, of a salesman, A salesman will be gathering information about prospects on an ongoing basis. How do we guarantee, or how do we secure that information within the GDPR guidelines? It may require a change to the way in which a salesman operates. So instead of perhaps immediately dropping contact details into his or her smartphone, perhaps there is some other process that the corporation has come up with that enables them to ensure that the integrity of that information, the confidentiality of that information is preserved. So training people, educating them about their obligations under the GDPR, I think is going to be an ongoing challenge. And indeed, it is probably one that certainly security and risk professionals have always traditionally struggled with. How do you consistently ensure that your users are at the correct level, if you like, in line with your risk appetite and, in this case, the requirements of a very far-reaching regulation?
Are people being exposed to or introducing themselves to different agencies or overseers in terms of who they have to talk to in terms of regulatory compliance?
Well, certainly the Information Commissioner's Office is the one that, for GDPR purposes, you will have had to have registered with. I mean, it's a very simple process. You simply complete an online form with them so that they understand, who is out there using what level of information. I think with the GDPR, where the real issue is going to come in is when or if an organization has a breach or indeed loses personal information. That's when the GDPR really kicks in, because you have to begin informing individuals within a very short space of time. You have to notify the Information Commissioner in your particular geography, and you have to be demonstrating that not only did you take all reasonable steps to secure the data, but that you have a recovery process in place and that you are following the letter of the regulation in terms of how you're going to try to recover the situation. So I think that for a lot of organizations, until that time when a breach occurs or information is lost, they do have something of a cushion to really make sure that they're in good shape when it comes to the GDPR. The challenge with all of that, of course, is you cannot predict when a breach is going to take place. And so if you aren't in good shape, you are playing something of a risky game, hoping that things don't go wrong before you've managed to get your house in order. And certainly it's not one that I would recommend.
In terms of looking for help and advice and solutions, where do people turn? I assume they have to speak to their lawyers, and they have consultants out there. Is technology a solution?
I think there are a number of different ports of call. I mean, the ICOs generally across Europe have done not a bad job of producing guidelines to what's required. So the ICO is a good port of call. Clearly, if you're a large organization, you will probably have engaged the services of a consultancy firm. They're very well equipped to really conduct some of the analysis that's required and to put in place some of the programs and processes for you. Technology, yes, can help to a certain degree, certainly in terms of some of the monitoring of information, of the cleansing of the information, and so on. But fundamentally, with GDPR, it comes down to being a people issue. That, for me, is the biggest risk, because you can have the finest processes in the world, you can have the best level of technology, and you can have conducted all aspects of assessment. But unless your users, the likes of you and me, fully understand their obligations when it comes to handling personal information and the way in which they share that information, then you can still come unstuck. So I think that, yes, all of these things are important. All of these things can help get you to a certain point. But as we go forward, I do think that perhaps some of the biggest risks are going to be around the way in which we as individuals, as employees, as well as corporations, use that information. And so one of the things that I always recommend is that you do have a fairly comprehensive user training program that you refresh on a regular basis in the light of the way in which you're tracking the response and the way in which you are then subsequently handling personal information as you go forward.
There was one major headline-making case of reputational risk and data handling risk in the case of, I'm referring to the case of Facebook.
Yes.
If I recall correctly, while Mark Zuckerberg, their CEO, was under a lot of heat in the public eye, he made a pledge, or I don't know if it was a full commitment, but he said that they were looking at the GDPR and thinking about offering GDPR type protections to everyone in their customer base. Was that noticed widely? And I don't know if he can accomplish that in a short period of time. But I thought it was interesting that he invoked GDPR while he was under all that pressure.
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations are taking that route, Jeff. I mean, certainly within the last few days, I've been talking to a number of very large corporations that are adopting the GDPR as being the standard that they're aspiring to. So Microsoft is one, for instance, that's going down that route as well. And the rationale behind it is if you are a large corporate that operates multinationally, then the chances are you're going to be holding personal information as it relates to an EU citizen at some juncture across your business. So you probably have to implement some elements of the GDPR, and it's probably easier for you to just adopt it wholeheartedly rather than to try to segment it. In the case of Facebook, and I think in a number of other organizations' cases as well, the GDPR wasn't suddenly something that was sprung on people. There was at least 2-year window of opportunity for organizations to try to get things in order, to ensure that their data was being handled appropriately in line with legislation that was very well advertised, talked about extensively. I mean, at the ISF, we produced a trilogy on it that goes back over 2 years now, in terms of helping our members, prepare for it, implement processes and programs around it. So I do think that those organizations that were thinking about GDPR seriously have begun the process. And those that haven't are really going to be playing catch up. And that will mean that it's quite an expensive process because you don't have the luxury of time on your side anymore.
How much did the penalties, which can be onerous, contribute to the awareness and action on the part of the corporate world that they're liable for significant penalties for non-compliance? There's also an element here of it's the right thing to do. Did the penalties serve as a wake-up call, or would we have gone in this direction anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a number of people who were on the working party for GDPR as it was being put together. And one of the things that they were very concerned about was that they didn't want to introduce another piece of legislation that could be ignored, and so that the penalties associated with it, which are up to 4% of global turnover, were there specifically to send the message that said, across the European Union, with this piece of legislation, privacy is being taken very, very seriously. And if you choose not to follow the guidelines, then we do have the ability as information commissioners to levy significant financial penalties that hopefully will get the interest of your organization and indeed your board. Now, and of course, we shouldn't forget that shareholders will also be involved in that because it will have an impact on stock and so on. Now, whether or not we're going to see ICOs implement those levels of penalty, we'll have to wait and see. I think that undoubtedly, when we do see some of the first breaches coming along, ICOs will want to make something of a statement around it. But the maximum penalty is really going to be reserved for organizations that I suppose have almost flagrantly ignored the GDPR. They haven't taken some of the basic steps. They haven't done all that was reasonably possible to protect personal information. So the GDPR, does have teeth. That was the intention. It does have far-reaching implications for organizations in terms of some of the financial penalties. But I always prefer to talk about it as a better way of doing business, of ensuring that you have a high integrity of information as it relates to your customer base, your staff, and so on, and ensuring that you can run your business in a much more effective manner rather than leaning back on the financial penalties that are associated with it. But of course, that is always what gets the headlines, and I think unfortunately that's certainly what we're going to be seeing as we go forward, because it's probably only short time before we do see a breach in this area, and then we will begin to see what the ICOs are going to do and how they're going to respond.
At the Information Security Forum, how much mind share was GDPR taking up in the run-up to the May 25th deadline, and has that changed? Is it still major?
It is a fairly major piece of legislation for all of our members. There's no getting away from that. Very many of them are entirely dependent on the way in which they manage personal information. I'm thinking about banks in particular, insurance companies, and so on. Organizations perhaps in the health services and so on. And so it certainly did take up a lot of mind share, a lot of time. I think going forward, it is another piece now of compliance, of legislation that organizations need to observe, that needs to be kept current. And I think that what organizations are really talking to me about now is not so much pulling out the GDPR itself as being perhaps a piece of legislation that has some quite significant overhead associated with it, but looking at it from a much broader compliance perspective, that this is another piece of legislation that has been put onto the compliance officer's list. And so the question, has to be, well, where is this going to end, if you like? Are we going to see even more legislation that's coming out in certain areas now? And from an organizational standpoint, how do we go about resourcing that effectively? How do we go about funding that effectively? Because, of course, once you do have these types of legislation out there, you can't ignore them. You do have to put in place compliance programs that ensure that you're in line with the expectations.
In terms of cyber risk and information risk threat landscape, what's on the horizon now? Is there mindshare being taken up by any particular hot buttons at the moment?
I think one of the challenges with this particular space, it is very, very fast moving. So crime as a service, ransomware, that's continually up there on the list for risk officers, for security professionals. I think some of the emerging things that we're seeing around Internet of Things is certainly something that is concerning organizations that are dependent perhaps on those devices. Knowing where they are, knowing how to manage them effectively is a big challenge in that particular space. The other one that really I think has been flushed out a little bit by GDPR is third-party risk. A lot of organizations now are talking very much about how can they manage supply chain third parties, particularly when perhaps they don't really know who is in that extended supply chain. So you may have a very good idea as to who you're sharing information with at the first level, or perhaps even the second level. But of course, today the supply chains are so intricate that really understanding how the information flows across that extended supply chain is a very real challenge. And GDPR, I think, has shone a little bit of a light on that. So we're seeing very much more concern around third-party management and third-party security than perhaps we had done for a little while.
I don't want to let the opportunity slip in conversation with you to bring up the risk management aspects of information security. How do you currently view the dialogue and attention to these issues as a risk management issue and the dialogue taking place between risk managers and those in the IT space?
Yeah, I think for me, and this won't come as any shock to you, Jeff. I'm firmly of the view that security is increasingly a risk-based issue. I think that organizations really do have to understand how some of the things we've just been talking about fit within their overall risk appetite, and that requires conversations to take place not just within risk, not just within IT, but across the whole business. Because increasingly, of course, we are devolving some of the responsibilities for the management of risk and the conduct of business to our end user departments. And so things like GDPR, things like some of the areas we've just touched on in terms of third parties and so on, really I think should be used as a means of having that much broader conversation across the enterprise. And I think the chief risk officer and his or her team have a key role to play in that particular space in terms of just understanding how different departments are making use of technology, making use of some of the things we've we've been talking about and how that relates to the overall business risk appetite, and whether or not there needs to be some changes, from the board level or indeed further down in terms of how the organization really views itself and goes to market in those areas to take into account some of the changes that we're seeing. I think the challenge in all of this, of course, is that we do now exist in a very, very fast-moving, fast-changing business environment. And so ensuring that there are regular checkpoints throughout the year for these sorts of things, I think, has become very much business as usual for organizations that are taking risk seriously.
Yeah, I might point out that third-party risk is now a focus of many regulatory bodies, and it's a cybersecurity risk, and it's also broader in the relationship with any third party. It's a big risk management issue because it extends beyond, or it encompasses cyber and many other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember when at the ISF we came out with our first third-party risk management tools, going back, a number of years now. And I was always surprised that we didn't see very much more take-up in that particular area. I think one of the things we have noticed of late is as you say, it becoming very much more relevant now across all aspects of an organization, and we're seeing very much more demand for those tools and those methodologies and approaches.
Well, Steve Durbin of the Information Security Forum, I want to thank you again for visiting with the GARP podcast series. It's always enlightening, and your insights are most welcome in our risk management community. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Jeff.
For more on this topic and others, please see the Risk Intelligence area of the GARP.org website. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.